Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. In today's video, what I want to discuss is appreciating nature in early Buddhism. What was the Buddha's feeling about our appreciation of nature? I did a recent video talking about how the Buddha did seem to believe that it was best for us to live or at least practice in the countryside, at least for his monastics and for serious people, serious Buddhist practitioners. The countryside was better than the village or town, or we might say city, to practice in. But what about appreciating nature itself? There's a kind of maybe a contradiction or a paradox, or at least a complication here that I think we should come to terms with, or at least contemplate, when we're thinking about nature. Now, many of us, I think, do associate Buddhist practice with the countryside. One famous example would be the Thai forest tradition. That is, in Thailand, there is a tradition of the really serious meditative experts having retreated into the forest and essentially established a relatively new kind of practice, at least within that tradition, in the 20th century. I believe it was in the early 20th century that the Thai forest tradition became established. Also within American Buddhist centers, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, there often is going to be a forest or a countryside retreat associated with the urban centers. So you have the Fire Lotus Center in Brooklyn, a Zen center that has the Zen center upstate, a Zen center out in the forest in upstate New York. You have the Brooklyn Zen Center that also has an upstate center associated with it. You have the many Tibetan centers as well that have forest or countryside retreats. You have the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies, which is off in the relative wilderness, not really, but in any event in a non-urban setting in Massachusetts. You have Spirit Rock out in California. All of these various retreat centers associated with Buddhism that are in the countryside. And even within cities, you will have there has been a tradition in Buddhism to try to bring the countryside into the city. Probably most famously, this happens in Zen centers in Japan. For instance, in Kyoto, many of the very famous Zen centers have a kind of a courtyard in which they reconstruct a wilderness setting in a sort of a perfected state, a sort of an absolutely, well, they are absolutely gorgeous as far as aesthetics goes. To my mind, it's sort of as beautiful as anything gets that humans have ever produced, but it's in an attempt to mirror what the forest or what the countryside would be like, but only in a sort of a miniature form, in a smaller form, within an urban setting, so that the monastics who are practicing there can contemplate that forest or that wilderness setting in front of them without having to leave the city. And so these Buddhist temples, these Zen temples, provide us with a kind of aesthetic perfection. And indeed, as I say, they are objects of contemplation for us. They can become objects of contemplation for our meditative practice. But they're also, we have to admit, they're objects of aesthetic enjoyment. We enjoy looking at them. And the monastics, the monks or nuns or whoever it is who were there are certainly going to enjoy seeing these things because they're so beautiful, these gardens. And if we look back thousands of years ago to early Buddhism, we find, at least in some places in the early texts, similar examples. One example of this is in a sutta where Sāriputta is out in the Gosinga forest at night. He is with a group of monastics and asks them to contemplate the beauty of that night and to compare it essentially to the beauty of a Buddhist practice. What he says is this. And here Sāriputta is talking to the Buddha's attendant, Ananda. He says, "Ananda, the sal forest park at Gosinga is lovely. The night is bright. The sal trees are in full blossom and divine scents seem to float on the air. what kind of mendicant would beautify this park? And so here, as I say, Sāriputta is asking the mendicants, the monastics around him, to essentially compare the beauty of that night to the beauty of practice, and indeed to ask how practice could make the place even more beautiful than it already is. And in order to do that, Sāriputta asks the monastics, basically with this sentence I've just read, asks the monastics to contemplate certain features, certain aspects of the beauty of the night. The flowers, the trees, the scent, the moonlight. These are all features of that night which bring beauty to mind. Another similar example is in a poem by Kassapa. Now, Kassapa or Kassapa was renowned as one of the most deep practitioners, a very, very rigid, we might say. Some people view him that way, at least nowadays, as being a kind of a rigid, unyielding, unbending kind of practitioner who was really interested in the deepest kind of practice. And in an early poem that he produced for the Sangha, which remains, it is in this book that compiles many early poems by early monastics, Kassapa also talks about the beauty of nature, of the wilderness. And he begins by basically warning us not to get too involved with the urban or village life involved in adulation and popularity. Because that's what happens when we get to large groups, particularly groups in a village, in a populated area, we might say even in a city. Kassapa talks about how quote-unquote respectable families are interested in such things. It's the respectable families who themselves are interested in being respected, in this kind of adulation, in this kind of popularity, in these kinds of contests of respectability, and we might say wealth and power. And that's the sort of thing that Kassapa warns us against. And in order to get to a place where we are outside of this kind of striving for adulation and popularity and wealth and power, it's best for us to retreat into the wilderness. Or at the very least, the wilderness is a place that gets us out of all of this. And in so doing, in lauding this kind of lifestyle, Kassapa composes this poem where he praises the beauty of the wilderness that surrounds him. So it's a long poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. I'll read some excerpts from it, but the poem goes like this. Returning from alms round, Kassapa ascends the mountain. Here he's talking about himself in the third person, we assume, and practices absorption without grasping. That is to say, he practices a deep kind of meditation. His task completed, free of defilements. Strewn with garlands of the musk rose tree, these regions are so delightful, so lovely, echoing with the trumpeting of elephants. These rocky crags delight me. Glistening, they look like blue storm clouds, with waters cool and streams so clear, and covered all in ladybugs. These rocky crags delight me. The rain comes down on the lovely flats, in the mountains frequented by hermits. Echoing with the cries of peacocks, these rocky crags delight me. Empty of householders, frequented by herds of deer, full of flocks of many different birds, these rocky crags delight me. The water's clear and the rocks are broad, monkeys and deer are all around, festooned with dewy moss, these rocky crags delight me. Now, there are several themes that Kassapa touches on in this poem. First of all, he touches on this theme that I mentioned earlier of these mountainous areas, these wilderness areas, being relatively free of human occupation. They're free of householders. The householders don't generally go into these wilderness areas. The only people there are these mountain hermits. So that's not to say that they're completely devoid of human life. That's not the point. The point is that the people there are people who really are devoted to their practice. So once again, we're not going to say that, that Sāriputta is necessarily saying, it's not Sāriputta, that Kassapa is saying that we should go alone necessarily, but at least that we should go where there are fewer people and there are people more attuned with their own kind of practice orientation. And in such a place, we're going to be somewhere that's, again, removed from these more worldly ends of praise and fame and reputation and of course power and money as well, wealth. We're going to be removed from all of those kinds of worldly ends, and that'll make practice easier for us. It'll make the life easier for us. Also, like we saw in Sāriputta's poem, Kassapa also touches on features, things that he notices in the environment that he finds beautiful. He talks about the trumpeting of the elephants. He talks about the deer. He talks about the ladybugs. He talks about the rain clouds. He talks about, of course, the crags and the rocks, the moss. All of these things are features of the life of the countryside that he finds beautiful, that he finds lovely. But there's another side of the coin here that I think is worthy of discussion and contemplation. I've mentioned these worldly ends of fame and praise and wealth and power and so on. But there's another worldly aim that the Buddha discusses in some detail, and this is the worldly aim of pleasure versus pain. And in many ways, the Buddha talks often, again and again, the way in which pleasure, in particular sense pleasure, can be a problem, can become problematic. In one very famous early sutta, and indeed in many suttas, the Buddha discusses what he calls the gratification, the danger, and the escape from sense pleasures in particular, these being really the most problematic of our pleasures. And when he talks about the gratification, the Buddha says that this is the pleasure and happiness that arise from these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation. Now, the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation are going to be sensual stimulation from our 5 senses, the seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling. So, for example, smelling the flowers at night, smelling the odor of distant rain, seeing the rocky crags and the ladybugs, hearing the cries of elephants or of peacocks in the distance. I mean, these are all examples, I would say important examples for our current discussion of sensual pleasures that come through one or the other of these 5 sense doors. So that's the gratification involved with the senses. Now, what's the danger? The danger is that we grow attached to these sense pleasures. And this is a danger which is open to all of us. That is to say, this is, we might say, the preeminent danger in early Buddhism, is that we become attached in particular to sense pleasures. We don't want them to leave. We find them so enjoyable that we either pine for them, we crave their continuance, or we actively work to help them to continue in ways that agitate our minds, agitate our lives, make life difficult for us, and indeed create dukkha, create pain and suffering for us in various ways. This is a large and complex problem here. But in any event, that's the danger. The danger is that we become attached to them. So what is the escape then? Well, the escape is indeed to give up that attachment, to give up that craving. And the way, at least in early Buddhism, one of the primary ways that the Buddha discussed giving up, at least the practice that would lead us to give up attachment for these kinds of sense pleasures, is called guarding the sense doors. Now, what does it mean to guard the sense doors? Well, what the Buddha says is that a person who guards their sense doors is somebody who, we can say, they don't get caught up in the features and details. Indeed, for the Buddha, it's precisely delighting in these features and details that tends to bring about craving. It's focusing on the parts of our sensory landscape that we find beautiful, that we find enticing that gets us to grow attached to them. And yet both of the examples that I've brought up today about praising nature in early Buddhism, the one from Sāriputta and the one from Kassapa, both of them involve, we might say, delighting in features and details. For Sāriputta, it was the features of the beautiful flowers and the scent and the moonlight. For Kassapa, well, there was a long, we might say, laundry list of features and details that he found enticing. And indeed, for that very reason, it's really rare in early Buddhism to find somebody, that is to say a monastic or the Buddha himself, praising the beauty of some sense pleasure, except as an example of something to be wary of. And that's why these examples from Sāriputta and from Kassapa are so interesting. We might wonder, is there something different about the sense pleasures involved with nature that, let's say, would distinguish them from the sense pleasures involved with enjoying something human-made, like, let's say, a house or some jewelry or a beautiful monument or something? Is there a difference between something human-made or let's say some food that's been cooked for us? A difference between something human-made, and enjoyment of that, and enjoyment of nature. Is there a difference here? Another way to consider this is to ask, can't we long for nature as well as we can long for human things? Can't we expend large amounts of effort and money in order to obtain nature in certain ways, in the same way that we may expend large amounts of money and effort to obtain human-created things? This is something that we might contemplate, because it's exactly this danger that the Buddha talks about when he talks about the dukkha, the pain and suffering involved with this kind of wish to obtain things. So that's really our conundrum here. That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Now, there are various different ways we might want to resolve this problem. I'll talk about two here. One of them is somewhat less satisfying, but may be correct. That is to say that perhaps we might want to say that both Sāriputta and Mahakassapa, they're arahants, they're enlightened beings. And as such, they have no attachment to anything in their sense fields. And so therefore, they can unproblematically discuss the features and details of the forest at night or the rocky crags around them. They're not going to be attached to them. So they can discuss them without problem. Now, why do I say that this is somewhat unsatisfying? Well, it's unsatisfying simply because if this is the case, then it sounds as though Sāriputta and Kassapa are being imperfect teachers here. They are, in their poetry, in their examples to others, doing things that would not be good for their audience, right? In other words, okay, maybe Sāriputta himself isn't attached to the beauty of the night, but he certainly is speaking, or potentially might be speaking to some monastics who are not arahants yet. And if he's going to speak in these ways, he might get them attached to it, and that's not really so skillful. Similarly with Kassapa, because Kassapa is presumably writing this poem that might be read and recited by, well, of course, wouldn't have been read at the time. There wasn't writing back then, but they would have at least been recited and memorized by monastics who might not have been enlightened yet. Now, the more satisfying answer here, or at least slightly more satisfying answer, is that there are, we might say, a range of sense pleasures. In Buddhism, and I've done a video on this in the past, there are a range of pleasures in general, where sense pleasures are at the bottom in the sense of being the most dangerous. There are higher pleasures that are less dangerous, all the way at the top being nirvana itself. But in any event, perhaps within sense pleasures, there's also a division that we might talk about or consider. And that perhaps pleasures of the natural world are less dangerous than pleasures of human interaction, where the human-created pleasures are ones that are more likely bound up in issues of money and power and influence, whereas the natural pleasures perhaps are more open to everybody. They perhaps don't require money because, of course, the the monastic with no money, the renunciant with no money can retreat into the forest at any time. And so for that reason, perhaps the pleasures involved with nature are less problematic. At least this is something that I would like to believe. It seems reasonable to think that natural pleasures are less of a problem in Buddhism than are the human ones. However, having said all of that, it certainly is also true that an enormous amount of money and effort is spent trying to recreate just those kinds of pleasures in places like Kyoto, in the homes of the most wealthy and powerful on earth, where they will try to recreate these kinds of forest environments within their own house, or of course within the environment of a monastery. The wealthy people will also buy up tracts of land in the most beautiful areas and preserve them for themselves. We all know of these kinds of examples. So nothing is very clear here, and I think as a result this is something that we ought to spend time contemplating. And let me know your own thoughts on all of this. And if you want to learn more about equanimity through sense restraint, or this idea of guarding the sense doors that I mentioned before in passing, I did a video on that a while back, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it, or would like to see it again. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and seeing if you want to help support the work that we're all doing here on this channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.